targeting the messenger. Marie Colvin's family sues Syria, alleging the journalist was killed deliberately to stop her reporting the regime's assault on Homs. Also in today's program, who owns the world's heritage? UNESCO holds its 40th session amid an unprecedented assault on cultural sites. And in Picture This, up and away, a Russian priest attempts to break the record for flying solo around the world. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Hama in 1982 was the hotbed of a rebellion against Hafez al Assad's rule over Syria. Over 27 days, much of the town was besieged and leveled, including its ancient Medina. Between 10 and 40,000 people were killed. Despite the carnage, not a single photo of the devastation saw the light of day. 30 years later, Hafez's son, Bashar, was attempting to put down his own insurgency in Hama's neighbour, Homs. Known as the capital of the revolution, it had been under siege by regime forces for over a year when Marie Colvin arrived. An accomplished war reporter, she filed her final story just hours before an artillery barrage killed her and the French photojournalist Remi Ochlik. Her family, citing classified documents, say Assad's forces deliberately hunted her down in an attempt to stop her story getting out. Our newsmaker today is Marie Colvin, as we ask whether the Syrian regime planned to silence her.
It's a conflict that has killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. But soon after the revolt against the Assad regime began in early 2011, it became clear that this war was equally dangerous for those who chose to cover it, from inside and outside of Syria.
Journalists in Syria today are threatened with death by everyone. Daesh, the regime. There's no place for journalists in Syria to work.
A point that became evident when one of the world's most experienced journalists lost her life in 2012. Marie Colvin of the British newspaper The Sunday Times was in the besieged Bab Amma area of the Syrian city of Homs.
I entered Homs on a smuggler's route, climbing over walls in the dark and slipping into muddy trenches. Arriving in the darkened city in the early hours, I was met by a welcoming party keen for foreign journalists to reveal the city's plight to the world.
The city of Homs in 2012 was one of the main battlegrounds of the conflict. Much of the city was controlled by the opposition from the early days of the war in 2011. The area of Bab Amma was the target of a severe bombardment by the Syrian regime. Marie Colvin and the French photographer Remi Ochlik were killed when bombs landed on their makeshift media center. This was a month after another journalist, Gilles Jacquier, was killed in an attack also blamed on Bashar al Assad's forces. The day before she died, Colvin was writing dispatches and talking via satellite to most of the international news networks.
It's a complete and utter lie they're only going after terrorists. The Syrian army is simply shelling a city of cold, starving civilians.
Marie Colvin was laid to rest 4 years ago, but now her family has filed a lawsuit in the United States against the Syrian regime.
It's very clear in a lot of the evidence we've uncovered that they wanted to silence the foreign journalists. That was exactly their intent, was to silence Marie and the other journalists who were trying to get the truth out.
The lawsuit names several Syrian officials, including the brother of Bashar al Assad, Maher al Assad, and it quotes documents ordering military campaigns against those who tarnish the image of Syria in foreign media and international organizations. There's no denying that this brutal conflict has been dangerous for journalists to cover. Since 2012, 96 journalists have been killed in Syria. And it's not just the Syrian regime that journalists fear. They're also at risk of death or kidnapping by a variety of rebel groups across the country. including Jabhat al-Nusra and most notably Daesh, while Syrian journalists have been assassinated in southern Turkey. In the eyes of Marie Colvin's family, her death 4 years ago is seen in a similar light, and for them, the Syrian regime is accountable. Francis Collins, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Exeter in the UK is Paul Conroy, a freelance journalist and survivor of the Bab al-Amr attack. Paul, a great pleasure to talk to you. You were there, you lived to tell the tale. There is this lawsuit now. What strong proof is there that Marie Colvin, Remi Ochlik and you and the others were actively targeted or hunted by the Syrian regime?
All right, thanks for having me on. There's two lots of evidence. I mean, the evidence from when I was in the media centre on that morning of the attack, I'd witnessed many attacks in Homs on civilians, and most of them, it was just random shelling. They had a small neighbourhood to target, and as long as they got the shells and rockets in there, they would kill or maim the civilians. This is what we witnessed. The morning of the attack on the media centre itself, it was a very different affair. They were using very accurate methods to fire the rockets in, adjust it from a drone, then move the rockets closer, finally targeting the centre that there were a lot of journalists in, foreign and Syrian. But once they had the targets on location, they kept shelling. This whole process was very, very different than the random shelling that was going on. That was my experience, and from that day I have said, you know, I believe quite firmly we were targeted. Since the investigation was begun by Marie's sister and Scott Gilmore, the lawyer who's investigated this, the evidence that's come out is, in my eyes, overwhelming. I won't go into great detail because I don't want to jeopardize any further legal aspects. But we have eyewitness accounts, a lot of documentary evidence that has been smuggled out of Syria, and defectors who were very, very involved in the actual attack and planning of the attack have come forward. So the evidence continues to grow, and I'm sure it will continue to grow.
So, I mean, it seems to be pretty clear that there was this relentless shelling, and it was targeted in many ways. But trying my very best to look at alternative theories, perhaps, and look at this big picture. Homs is a war zone. There are multiple belligerents. Rebels have also shelled zones in the past. Is there any possibility that it could have been anyone else, any one of those multiple other groups?
Okay, I'll tell you, I was with the Free Syrian Army rebels for quite a long time in Syria. I was on the front line with them. I never saw any arm in their possession larger than, say, an RPG-7, which is a handheld, a shoulder-held missile. The other weapons I saw in their possession with the actual other protagonists in the situation, Kalashnikov small arms, Makarov pistols, I saw nothing larger than handheld rockets. The rockets that actually hit the building and around the building on the day of the attack were 120mm rockets. These were not in possession of the Free Syrian Army. At that point, there were no al-Nusra and there were no ISIS fighters. This was very early on. So, no, I mean, I've been through this and I've obviously considered it, but, you know, I witnessed the same weapons being used in countless attacks. The only people in possession of these weapons were forces loyal to the Assad regime.
Yeah, right. Now, just recently, an Al Jazeera reporter was killed by a Russian airstrike. That was on Monday. Reporters Without Borders has statistics that show that 110 journalists were killed in 2015 worldwide, 67 while reporting or because of their work. Since 2012, 96 journalists have been killed in Syria. We heard that in Francis's report as well. So I wonder, you know, how likely is it that a ruling in this particular case, justice for Marie Colvin and Remi Ochlik, would bring about some level of accountability, that we'll see less of these awful numbers come 2017 and 2018, not just in Syria, but around the world, where nation states or terror groups or whoever would think twice about actively targeting journalists?
Okay, I mean, on the subject of actively targeting Germans, I mean, there are so many rules in place. You know, the Fourth Geneva Convention specifically prevents the shelling of civilians and journalists. I think what would make the biggest difference is if them rules were enforced. I mean, we know it happens. The death rate amongst journalists nowadays is phenomenal. But there's an onus on people to enforce the rules already in place. We could introduce more rulings, but unless people are held to account for this, then I fail to see how more legislation will make any difference. It's about using existing legislation and enforcing it. I mean, that would make the difference. I don't think we need more. I think we need enforcement of legislation in place.
You had a close shave with death. You've lost friends. You were there to witness this carnage and killing. What would make you happy? Do you want to see Maher al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad in the dock at The Hague? Would that be justice?
I think what would be justice, to be very frank, yes, of course, I would like to see them in a dock. But I would also like to use this opportunity where, you know, the regime is now being unmasked. Over the last 4 or 5 years, you know, nearly 500,000 people have lost their lives, so many people displaced. And unfortunately, ISIS complicated the situation. They came along, stole away a lot of the headlines and gave people something to focus on. I would like this case to refocus the prism back on this regime who have, you know, systematically, and I witnessed this, I won't talk about anything I didn't see. I watched that regime slaughter civilians, women and children. And I think if this case, this legislation, puts the spotlight on just what these people are capable of, I would be happy to see the international community look at the Syrian regime at the moment and say, these are not people we should be involving in peace talks. These are not people we should do business with. The Syrian people shouldn't have to live under this regime. And for memory of Marie, all of the journalists, Syrian and foreign, and all of the Syrian people, I think this is an opportunity to put the spotlight on the people who have caused the vast amount of damage in Syria to people, and that is the regime of Bashar al Assad. They are not people we should do business with.
Paul, appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Paul Conroy joining us there from Exeter. Thank you very much. Still to come on the Newsmakers, we're asking who the world's heritage sites really belong to. And in Picture This, the Russian balloonist hoping for a record-setting trip around the world. There are more than 1,000 sites on the World Heritage List, and this month a UNESCO committee is deciding whether to add more. But who do these places belong to? Locals, tourists, historians, or governments? And does an international organization have the power to protect the cultural heritage of every country? The Newsmakers' Yvette McCullough reports.
Heritage sites give us a glimpse into the past. They're reminders of lost civilizations and reflect the planet's diverse landscape. They inspire through art and awe, but their beauty and appeal can also be their downfall. The hundreds of thousands of visitors these sites attract are slowly destroying them. According to UNESCO, these places and artefacts belong to all the peoples of the world, irrespective of the territory on which they're located. But should the safekeeping of these beauty spots be put in the hands of an international organisation? India's Taj Mahal, Rio de Janeiro's Carioca landscape, and Cambodia's Angkor Wat are all protected by the World Heritage Convention, along with 1,028 other sites across the world. Former US President Richard Nixon signed the convention in 1973, handing over the care of international sites and monuments to the United Nations. It covers sites considered to be of such exceptional interest and such universal value that their protection is the responsibility of all humanity. But the committee is accused of failing to protect these places, especially, but not only, in war zones. Daesh has all but obliterated the ancient Syrian city of Palmyra. UNESCO's power is no match for guns and bombs. Some say the concept of World Heritage is a threat to national sovereignty, that UNESCO takes ownership of sites and artefacts that should belong to the countries where they're located. UNESCO says that without its protection, heritage sites could deteriorate and even vanish, and ancient artefacts could be at risk of theft and destruction, as selling stolen antiquities in markets around the world is a good way to earn hard cash.
Everywhere in the world, states are mobilising to stop the illegal trafficking of cultural goods. The UN Security Council sees this cultural issue as a security issue.
So does UNESCO have the right and means to protect World Heritage, and is it failing to do so? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss who, if anyone, World Heritage actually belongs to is Francesco Bandarin. He's UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Culture and joins me from the World Heritage Summit in Istanbul. And in Brighton is Michael Hitchcock. He's a Professor of Cultural Policy and Tourism at Goldsmiths University and the author of The Politics of World Heritage Sites. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Francesco Bandarin. Who, if anyone, do these sites actually belong to?
Well, no doubt that the sites belong to the governments and the people where they are placed. I mean, obviously, UNESCO ensures and provides an additional layer of protection for those sites, but in no way the sovereignty of the states and the governments and the local communities is infringed. In fact, it is under proposal of the governments that the sites are described. UNESCO can only assess and evaluate the proposals. We don't choose and pick.
Let's go to Michael Hitchcock. I want to ask you about a very specific place, Palmyra. Is there ever really the chance to fully protect the heritage in Palmyra? And we've already lost some of it, unless and until the war in Syria actually comes to an end.
There could be a case, in fact, for international protection of heritage in cases like Palmyra, because UNESCO really doesn't have the resources and power to protect these sites. However, UNESCO has a kind of moral power and ethical power that it can raise to public awareness the importance of these sites. And remember, these sites are important because they are part of the intellectual fabric of the civilizations that we've inherited, and so UNESCO's recognition and UNESCO's skills are important.
Francesco, the Director General of UNESCO, Irina Bukova, says attacks on heritage are a war crime, and that's fascinating terminology, because how is that justified when even something like the killing of children has to go through some very rigid legal standards to be considered a war crime? Is she playing hard and fast with the terminology here, using a term that should really be reserved for something that's absolutely clear-cut?
Yeah, sorry, yes. She used the terms, of course, crimes against culture, against humanity, but there is, in fact, a definition of war crime, and it's clearly in the statute of the International Criminal Court. There, Article 8 of the statute clearly identifies and describes the destruction of heritage as a war crime. And in fact, next month of August, there will be the first trial against one of the persons that has destroyed the mausoleums of Timbuktu. So it is a war crime. He's been indicted, and he will be hopefully sentenced for a war crime, the destruction of a monument. So clearly this is a small thing compared to other very much more serious crimes against people. But let's not forget that culture is not separate from the humanitarian law. This is a point that we want really stress, and many people agree with us, even in the humanitarian world. A culture of a community is very important for its survival. There is no humanitarian action and humanitarian interventions not just made of bringing foods and tents. You also have to protect the culture of the community that are affected. We have a case now in Syria. You just mentioned Palmyra, but not forget that there are 8 million people displaced in Syria. I'm in Turkey at the moment. There are 3 million refugees in Turkey from Syria. How are these people ever going to rebuild their lives and their communities if we forget that they have a culture? This culture has to be protected. It's part of the humanitarian effort.
Michael, how do we prioritize what deserves more protection over others?
I think it's very difficult to prioritize if you're making stark contrast between human lives and heritage. But I'd just like to say that it deserves to be given a very high priority because heritage sites are part of people's culture. They're part of people's identity. And after World War II, when UNESCO and other UN bodies began to debate the kind of war crimes that are being considered, one of the things that came out of these debates was the importance of heritage. Now, the heritage debate intensified really in the period of development that came after World War II, particularly with the great concerns about the building of the Aswan Dam and the possibility that part of Egypt's heritage could be submerged below water of the new lake. Now, the World Heritage Convention was designed to make sure that these sites were protected, and it's very important for it to be protected forever, for all of humanity. And so I would say that I don't quite like the idea of say you balance a human life against a heritage site. I don't think it's a very helpful way of doing it. But what I can say with great clarity is that by destroying these sites, you are, in a way, committing a crime which we could call ethnocide, or in fact a crime against culture, which has very long-term and serious ramifications.
Interestingly put. Francesco, I want to go into this idea of whether UNESCO plays politics or not, and what that balancing act might be. Again, I go back to what Irina Bukova has said, the Director General, saying that the World Heritage approach, and part of the mandate is to, quote, is about affirming human values and human rights. And that makes me think about North Korea, because I was recently in North Korea. North Korea has some UNESCO World Heritage sites. I visited one in Kaesong. How do you affirm human rights by affirming a sort of legitimacy to North Korea, which is a totalitarian dictatorship? Aren't you making life a little bit easier for them?
But first of all, we don't give any legitimacy to governments. That's not our role. We legitimize and protect heritage. This is quite a different thing. So, in fact, I'm very happy that we were able to put Koguryo tombs and many other North Korean sites in the World Heritage List, because by so doing, we have protected heritage of humanity. So it's a completely different approach. Our policy is nothing to do with legitimizing governments. We are working on the other side. We work on heritage, both in terms of inscribing heritage and in terms of protecting it. For instance, let's go back to the case of Syria, as you mentioned. At the moment, there are some sites in Syria that are under government control. Other sites are under opposition control. For instance, Bosra or other sites are under the opposition. But this is not the problem for us. I mean, it's clearly more difficult to operate, but we are going to help all those who want to preserve and safeguard those sites. So, and by doing so, we follow the recommendation of the World Heritage Committee, which has put all the World Heritage sites of Syria in the list of World Heritage in danger. They have not selected those who were under control of the government or make a difference between them. So we don't look at the politics, we look at the situation of the site.
Unfortunately, I've got to wrap because we are out of time. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I have learned a lot from both of you, Michael Hitchcock and Francesco Bandarin. In today's Picture This, Russian adventurer Fedor Konyukov has begun his quest to make the fastest solo flight around the world in a hot air balloon. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker was Marie Colvin, as we asked whether her death could start to hold the regime accountable. Her family's case against the regime alleges collusion from the top level down. Our guest, Paul Conroy, who was with her at the time, says there was nothing random about the attack. Whatever the case, it should serve as a reminder that Daesh is not the only brutal force in Syria. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye-bye.